Right. Hello. My name is Ben Waymark. I'm CTO at Webio. I'm going to start this off just talk a little bit about my accent because whenever I do these things, people always have this confused look on their face. Unfortunately, I can't see the confused look on people's faces, um, but I assume that it's going to be there anyways. So if anyone's wondering, I grew up in Canada. I've lived in Nottingham for the last 10 years. I've lived in Devon and London, and I've been working for about the last 5 years quite a bit in Ireland, and I seem to just randomly absorb and spit out weird accents at different times. So, in case you're wondering why my accent's all over the place, that's why. Can't help it. There you go. Now you know. So, that being said, I'm going to talk today about the four pillars of tech leadership. Just a really quick background on myself. I have originally had a degree in history, studied mostly medieval history and classics in Eastern Canada. I then went to this course called ITI Information Technology Institute, which was a short-lived sort of private college that did a master conversion style degree, and in there we covered, this has been late 1990s, and we covered Oracle and case method data modeling. We covered networking, including this really exciting new technology at the time called TCP/IP that's just going to change everything. We did Visual Basic and Power Builder, and then we also had there's this thing called the interwebs that were being built, and on these interwebs you had these web pages, and I got really excited about building web pages. So my first job was actually as a network support. It was a network support engineer, and then what happened was I sort of moved on from there um, to doing websites. So I came to London, got a job, very luckily, just as the dot-com boom was sort of happening. Um, didn't really, I'd done a few websites, but nothing really major. And I think I might have sold myself, because I sort of started at this job in London, and my first day, bright eye and bushy tailed and off the plane. And I got sequestered in a room with this like high powered project manager from who was it? I think it was Deloitte and Touche. It was one of the big consultancy companies, and they put me and a designer, and they locked us in a room and wanted us to build this top secret project, which was an MP3 player, which in 1997 was a really kind of big deal, or 98. Actually, no, it was 1999 by then. But anyway, so I did that, and that was all great fun until the dot-com boom exploded. Then I went off to ITV, where I worked in interactive TV and became a manager of what was called the ITV Interactive Testing and Broadcasting Facility. And that was a facility where we tested all the applications that came in before they were broadcast on TV. And then we actually did the broadcasting as well. So a big kind of cool one on that was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where you could press the red button and you could play along. From there, I went off to BBC and worked as a network engineer for them. Then I got bored and wanted to move out to the countryside. So my wife, who's a designer, and I started a web agency, did that for, let's say, 10 years. Then we had this great idea of doing this startup that it was going to make us millions, or it was going to bankrupt us. And well, it didn't make us millions, and it didn't quite bankrupt us, but it got really close. So in desperation, I took a job working for BMI Regional Airlines in Castle Donington, and we'd recently moved to Nottingham, or fairly recent, within a couple of years. And this new airline, it was an old airline that had started up as a new airline. So I ended up getting a job with them and learnt a surprisingly amount of a knowledge about sort of how airline systems work, especially booking systems. That then got me a job working for OpenJaw, first as a tech architect, then as a product manager. And then from there, COVID hit, and the travel industry went to a sudden grinding stop. So any dreams we had of doing great booking systems for airlines came to an end. And then now I'm working for a CTO for a company called Webio. Now let's get on to the next slide. So Webio, a little bit very quickly about what Webio does is we build conversations for the credit and collection agency. So we're a small team, mostly located in Ireland, but also in UK, France, and Spain. And what we do is we make software for companies like Very, if anyone's familiar with Very Group. They do short short-term credit that allows people to buy consumer goods that they might not otherwise be able to afford. So if you think of it in terms of something like a mobile phone contract, they do that type of credit. And what we do is we automate those conversations so that it basically gives Veri an opportunity to give this credit out, to be able to have those conversations, but not to be able to have massive call centers full of people. Well, they do have massive call centers anyways, but we're working to help automate that. Especially the idea is to take a lot of the drudgery about it, to answer a lot of the simple questions. And this is doing that with artificial intelligence, and it's quite exciting, and it's very much in line with what I was working with at OpenJaw as well, where we did a similar thing, or tried to do a similar thing for airlines. So this is the obligatory, hey, look how great we are, these are all the important people we work with. And that brings me to the 4 pillars of technical leadership. So what I want to do is I want to talk about these 4 pillars, but before I sort of go into what these 4 pillars are, I think it's important to lay down a bedrock of foundation that these pillars stand on. And that bedrock of foundation is communication and listening skills. There's nothing, these pillars, nothing else makes a difference when it comes to leadership as much as your ability to listen and your ability to communicate. So a very good sort of illustrative example of this. And if we could we put up the tech architect poll? Is that going to work? There we go. There's a tech architect poll. Trying to make this fun by having polls pop up. Not entirely sure if it's going to work, but I see it popped up there. So that's good. So we had a tech architect, we'll call him Buddy, to protect the innocent. He was really good at his job. He was really good. His ability to sort out a vision, to choose the right technology was outstanding. He also had a terrible habit of either making fellow developers really angry or occasionally cry. And it was kind of a big problem. And it was a big problem because nobody wanted to work with him. And what had happened is HR had talked to him, project managers had talked to him. And eventually it fell upon me to be the one to sort of try and help sort of work out this problem, because he was a great tech architect, but it really was becoming an issue with communication. So what I did is I sat down with Buddy and had a talk with him, and he sort of admitted that his communication skills weren't great, and you know, he was very blunt, which was probably the biggest problem. But he was also often right, which made him, as in correct, which made him particularly irritating for his coworkers. So I was sort of talking to him, and he was talking about how he'd struggled with communication, and his problem was that whenever he tried to talk to his team never really engaged with him. He would ask questions and they would never really answer, likely because he was incredibly blunt and sort of had this reputation for making people cry. So I sort of we had sort of talked to him, and we'd had a good chat about what the problem was. And then I started saying, well, you know, is anyone in the team really good at communication? And which I sort of knew beforehand. It was kind of coaching him into it. But it turned out that the senior engineer who we worked with was a really good, they got on quite well, and he was a really good communicator. So what ended up happening is we sort of worked together with, and then started saying, sorry, with Buddy. Oh, I used his name there. Pretend I said Buddy all along. We worked together with Buddy, and we came to the conclusion that his lead architect would be, lead engineer would be the one that would do all the communication. And that ended up working really well because it took the pressure off him to try and communicate, meant that the team was able to talk with someone that they were able to, and then this lead engineer would kind of act as the facilitator of conversation between the two of them. And also for both of them, it meant a lot of the stress dissipated. And what was also funny for Buddy was he actually became a much better communication as a result of this. Lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so he just became a much better communicator, and that really did make a difference. And so the point I'm making here is that everything that we talk about, without having that communication, all we would have had was a problem. Without having that communication there working out these pillars that I'm about to talk about, you're not really able to build them on anything. So the 4 pillars themselves, it's progressing the product is the first pillar. Progressing the technology is the second pillar. Progressing the team is the third pillar. And then with all of these, what you need to do is control the budget. So you progress the you progress the product, you progress the technology, you progress the team, you control the budget, and that sort of becomes the framework of what everyone's trying to do in tech leadership in one way or another. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about progressing the product. So can we put the product management poll up now? So your product is your end result, and I use the burger analogy here. And if you're sort of thinking about what is a product, the product would be, in this case, would be the burger. So if you're a tech leader, you'll have a load of engineers, a load of people whose job it is to have all the detail. Their job it is to make sure that the beef or beef alternative patty that you're doing, that the buns, that every single component is all correct. But because they're working on the details, they're not really able to look at the whole picture. So when I talk about the progressing the product, it means making sure that, well, all the details are taken care of, that you're actually moving somewhere, that that product continues to improve. And probably where the sort of the burger analogy for a product fails a bit is that unlike a sort of a burger that's kind of stayed the same forever, in software, it's always changing. It's always moving. And for a leader, this becomes very difficult, because what you find is that you get stuck between engineers and software developers who desperately want to try and slow things down, to have some stability. They want to make small changes. They want to take what they've done before and improved it. And then you've got usually a commercial or a sales team that are just desperate for everything to progress as fast, and as quick as they possible. And as the leader, what your job is, the leader of the technology, what your job is to do is to work with your CEO to be able to find the balance between those two. Because really that's what it's all about. You have to progress the product without going so fast that you sort of lose the other pillars that I'm about to talk about. At Webio, what we do is we have what's called the 666 methodology. And what we do is every 6 weeks, we have a meeting with a company and we map out what specifically we're planning to do for the next 6 weeks. And that's sort of the details. Then more broadly, what we're planning to do for the next 6 months. And then also what we're planning to do for the next 6 years. So that gives us the short, medium, and long-term vision of everything that we do. And a big part of working as the CTO, working as a technical leader, is to keep this progression, to keep this vision of the short, the medium, and the long term. Now, the biggest tool kind of in your sort of bow in your quill or whatever is getting the roadmap. Now, can we put the product roadmap poll up now, please? And a solid roadmap is really important. Now, your product management team or your CEO or whoever's doing that sort of function will have their roadmap. Or if they don't, it's actually quite important as a CTO that you get one built. It's important, and it also sort of illustrates another bit of the communication aspect of the role, because you probably, most likely, sometimes product managers report to the CTO, but usually they don't. Often it's actually the CEO who ends up, especially in smaller companies, who sort of does this role. But as a tech leader, part of your job, part of your communication is to set the corporate IT vision. And that means that you have to be able to influence people who are outside of your immediate direct reports. And one of those people will always be whoever's doing the product. Usually it's the sales team and everyone else as well. And what you need to do is you need to work with them, work with product management to get a real technical roadmap that gives you all the steps that you need to take along the way, that make sure that it's going somewhere, because you can do little steps forever without actually moving forward. And that's I find anyways is the most helpful sort of bow in your quill, is to have that roadmap and to build something out that's not the product roadmap, not the specific feature roadmap, but it's what you're planning to do to fulfill that product roadmap. So as well as progressing the product and making sure that the product kind of keeps going, you also have to make sure that the tech keeps changing, that your technology keeps progressing. tech changes very quickly, and a big part of the role ends up being not just sort of seeing what's coming over the horizon, but trying to sort of evaluating and decide which way you should go. And usually when it comes to progressing the technology, the sort of the collaborative approach of a CTO becomes very important. I've worked with sort of senior leaders in China, and I find this is somewhere where they often really struggle, because a lot of the educational system and a lot of the way that sort of companies build up in China, especially the ones that we were working for that were all state-run enterprises, they find that level of collaboration can be very difficult. And what you end up with is a CTO, usually who's a bit out of date in their technology, because I mean, I started off an engineer. Most CTOs start off as some sort of engineer, but very quickly you learn that you can't sort of do the executive side of the roles and keep 100% over all the details of the technology. So what this means is you need to progress the technology by having usually a collaborative approach with your team that basically helps you pull out of them really where we should be going and what we should be doing. And if you have a vision, you sort of need to work that vision with your team rather than sort of say, here's what my plan is, you guys all have to do it. I actually had a very good example of this recently, where we have at the moment at Webio, we have a big sort of cluster of databases that we use, and all the customer data's on there. We have various different methods that we use for isolating the different tenants. And I was sort of looking at a bigger view, and I sort of had this really kind of brilliant idea. I thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic. And if you could put that split database poll up, that should make sense in a sec. But I had this brilliant idea about saying, let's use serverless technology to basically split all this one big database into a whole bunch of small little databases. So there'll be one for each customer. And I was, sort of sat in amazement at my own brilliance for a few minutes. And then I sort of brought the idea really excitedly to the team, and they all starked me down and were asking what the benefits are and why we were doing that and talking about all the headaches involved. And I was really deflated, because in my own deluded mind, I thought, oh, this is such a brilliant idea. How come they can't jump in on it? But these things happen all the time, so that's fine. I'm sort of working through it, thinking through it, and then I'm at a totally different meeting. We're talking about mentoring in the company with one of the lead engineers, and he was sort of saying, totally unrelated to this, about how previously they had an architect and a lead dev who was very possessive of the technology. And he used to aggressively defend the code. And whenever somebody wanted to put any sort of big structural change, he really drilled into them to be very sort of clear about why they were doing it, and how stability always happens to be first. And, it's great to have good ideas, but you have to think about stability and not change things just sort of because. And it was a real lesson. I mean, it was a actual real lesson to me, because in the first bit, with my seemingly great idea sort of being shot down, there's that degree of being crestfallen and everything. But taking the time to listen to this is sort of, when I heard that, suddenly it kind of all dawned on me that actually not only should I have probably listened more to that at the beginning bit, but also it's really important to recognize that actually what these people were saying, that whole approach of doing the stability first, it's the right approach. It was the right thing for them to do. And I don't think I sort of let them say, oh, whoever voted to say I was right, well done you. Everyone else, I saw the things on the polls there, and someone thought I was right in doing it. I'm glad someone agrees with me. But yeah, so I still think it's a good idea. I will likely go ahead with this at some point, at least looking into the idea. But the sort of, when we go towards it, when we look at it, it's now going to be in a lot more sort of stability focused, and actually let's look on this. And so this is a key bit, and it's important to progress the technology, but that doesn't mean just moving everything in sort of a slapdash way. And it especially doesn't mean sort of going in and dictating, I read an article on how we should be doing this, and let's do this. Stagnation is certainly death in IT. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of engineers that get really excited about new stuff, and there's a lot of engineers that don't. And usually you want to try and have a balance between the two. Through the course of the 20, 25, whatever it is, years that I've been working in IT, I've seen that's gone from dial-up modems and installing things with 20 floppy disks to SAS models and instant updates and everything we have now, and yet still come across organizations. I mean, I do this at Webio quite a bit, that their primary form of communication with people is by sending out collection letters by post and then following up with a phone call. And they can't quite understand why they're not communicating anyone, because there's no one in their organization who's progressing the technology or told them that pretty much everyone under about 30 or possibly even 40 now simply won't answer most phone calls for any reason whatsoever. So at least if my kids are anything to go by. So progressing the technology is very important, and a big part of the progression of the technology, it's staying the fresh. It's keeping your team fresh. It's keeping yourself fresh. There's a lot of small things that we can do. Events like this are absolutely brilliant. Always try and encourage anyone I can, anyone who will listen, that going to conferences, going up to meetups, trying to get mentorship for people is, I think, is really important. Trying to put people, especially outside of the organization, or trying to get people who can mentor without necessarily, because mentorship in a power, when there's a power dynamic, can be difficult. So I'd love to sort of take on each of the team and mentor them myself, but it can be difficult when they sort of when you sort of have that degree of authority and say over some key aspects of their lives. So trying to find especially neutral memberships that can really help them grow and help them sort of find out what they want to do. It's also in the staying fresh is actually where diversity becomes really important. And in this matter, diversity is more than just having a balance of gender identities, of orientations and ethnic backgrounds. I mean, very important to have that as well, but it's looking for a real balance as well of people who maybe trying to get people on the team who grew up really poor or really rich, or on farms or in boats or in different countries, or had some sort of unique experiences. And when you start bringing all these, when you bring the diversity onto the team, and then you ensure that the team and all the different people in the team develop their unique skills around their different backgrounds, that's where you kind of get the staying fresh going as well. I had a sort of a kind of half funny and half horrific event that happened a few years ago. The guys I was working with was owned by this Chinese company that I was mentioning earlier, and I went up to Dalian, which is in North China, not far from Pyongyang in North Korea. And it was my first time going to China. It was very exciting. And I landed in Beijing and got met by a team member there, and then flew to Dalian. And if you've never been to China before, it's quite an incredible place, simply because it's sort of everything's different. The signs are different, the smells are different, there's noises are different. It's just everything about it. You sort of get bowled over by how just unusual everything is if you've never been in that environment before. So I sort of get to Dalian and get to the hotel, and that's great. And then I wake up all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed the next day, and I'm driving through this city. It was this tiny little city in China, which is probably why you heard of it. Don't even think it has up to about 16 million people, which pretty much makes it a village. And so I'm kind of going through this town of Dalian, and then suddenly where our office was on this big sort of tech park. We pulled up into the tech park, and I swear the minute we turned into the tech park, I could have been in San Francisco, I could have been in London, I could have been down in the creative quarter, I could have been in Dublin, in Galway, and all sorts of different places, because suddenly it's just everything starts looking tech. And it was kind of neat. It was kind of cool thinking, oh yeah, look, there's all the people with their Beats and the backpacks and their own mugs and all these different things. But another part of it was a bit sad, because it's a bit like, oh, are we really that samey? And I think as an industry, we really have to make effort to try and break out, sort of break out of that loop a little bit, and really try and encourage much more of a different just basically pushing for more diversity in order to keep this freshness. Because if we don't have that diversity, if we keep everything all sort of packed up around there, what you end up with is not staying fresh. You end up, people kind of get the same ideas and they go around the same loops, and nothing really moves forward. So Progressing the team. That's our third pillar there. And progressing the team's really important because you progress the product, you progress the technology. Now what you have to do is you have to get that team going. And this is where team balance becomes really important, because having 4 brilliant coders won't necessarily make as good of a team as having one person who's maybe really brilliant at architecture, someone else who's a really good sort of head down engineer, another person who's really good at refining backlogs, and then somebody else who's a really good communicator. Think about Buddy and the senior engineer. So what you want to do is you want to get the right team balance, and you want to get the whole team, which can be individual teams that develop and the department as a whole. You want to sort of keep everyone moving and moving forward. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Dunning-Kruger. In fact, if you want to put that progression poll up now, that might be handy. The Dunning-Kruger effect. In the Dunning-Kruger effect, what happens in the context of engineers is you'll often find that if you ask engineers how sort of good or not they are, your best engineers will often rank themselves as the worst, and your worst engineers will often rank themselves as the best. So sometimes part of this team progression is taking the people that might be really good and kind of don't believe it yet, and kind of convincing them that they actually do have something to offer, or taking the people that think that they're just knocking it out of the park all the time and maybe actually not quite as good as they think they are, and sort of help them get up to where they want to be or where they think they are. I had a friend a few years ago, kind of funny. He was working as a tech manager. It was his own company, and he was the CTO there. And he had one of his best engineers. One year he went in, I think the guy was on something like around £40,000 a year. And he went in, he said, "Oh, you've been doing really good. I really want to bump you up. I want to bump you up to 50,000. And the engineer basically just turned around and said no. He said, "I'm not quite ready. I'm not ready to take that responsibility. I'd find that really difficult." So he said, "Okay, if you want to refuse a pay rise, that's sort of on you." And then the next year he offered him, this time actually a little more. I think it was 55 or something like that. And he still said no. And so he's kind of like getting a bit sort of reluctant here, but whatever. If the guy doesn't want to make money, keeps the accountants happy. And then the third year after that, he found himself going to this guy, asking him yet another 5,000. This time turning around and saying, "Well, look, you have one or two choices. You either accept 60,000 as a pay rise, become the senior engineer you need it to be, or you're going to have to leave the organization, because we need you to progress." Like, they didn't need somebody who was going to be stuck at the level that he was at. And he sort of made the right decision, accepted the money. And actually from there, once he sort of broke out of that and convinced himself that he was worth the money, he actually just became better and better and worked from strength to strength. And that's another big part of progressing the team. It's taking that sort of imposter syndrome that most people have and helping them sort of work through that and to really bring out the best in everyone. Part of this as well, which is sometimes not the easiest part, but some of this includes what I kind of sometimes refer to as the engineer lifecycle management. Sometimes it can be great. It means you sit down, you discuss with your engineers, you find out, who really wants to 10x their tech skills, really double down on the technology and become really good at it, who wants to go into management, but then also looking at who works best in a team, who works best alone, and what you can do to sort of accommodate the different skills and different types of working that people may have, and how to help them progressing. Sometimes, and this is the not so pleasant part, is sometimes that also means looking at who might be better off, not like kicking them out, but maybe sort of gently suggesting that it might not hurt for them to go off. And I've seen this before, where engineers have been encouraged to go off, and they've gone off for a couple of years and come back to the same organization, and it's actually worked out really well. Sometimes leaving an organization isn't the worst thing, and it's a good way to broaden your horizons. Progressing the team, this is also where mentorship is really important. Because with a good mentor, what it does is it starts making it a lot more clear what paths are available. There's the 10x engineer, there's things like product management, there's sales support, there's sales, there's account management, there's project management, tech architecture, tight leads. These are some of the more common kind of known career paths. And then there's all sorts of others around things that you can do with QA and leading QA teams and DevOps, and often what people need is a bit of exposure and a bit of someone that can help people find out really what works for them, because usually that's what's going to work best for your organization as well. So another just quick word on diversity here. Maybe you could put up the job interview poll. Progressing the team can mean working with some of the finer points of diversity, sort of that I mentioned before. But sometimes it also means really trying to find out who you can bring in and how you can bring them in. So one of the things that's often found is that people that are neurotypical will do terrible in a sort of typical scenario of a job interview. But if you find different ways of sort of talking to them and evaluating, you may find that they work out really well. And then if they do work out, if you do find actually they really do have the skills, sometimes it's also looking at what you can do to help them. Like, do you need to have bits of the office that are quieter or louder or lighter or darker or hotter or colder? And then it also means working in the diversity with things like finding out what you can do to accommodate parents and carers, especially those that are sole carers. It's looking at things like generational conflict, as well as sort of what sometimes are the strengths and weaknesses of different generations and how those can help with that sort of progression of the team. And then also what you can do, there's things like what you can do without how to progress people with university degrees. Now, there was an interesting study that I read a while ago, and I believe it was all in America, in the United States. But one of the things they found is that something as simple as being clear about what university degrees, what skills and what qualifications are needed for a role can often help increase the number of women applicants you get. Because again, in this sort of study that I read, it was more common for men to apply for jobs that they didn't feel that they had qualifications for, and less common for women. So what a lot of tech hiring managers have done over the years, where they just basically ask for the moon and everything and then see what they end up with, might actually be something that's stopping people from being able to get the right type of diversity. Now, every organization, every country, every culture, every city, everything is going to be a little bit different, but it's sort of working to see what you can do to get people on, and to do things like, how do you progress an engineer who doesn't have a university degree, doesn't speak English as a first language? How do you encourage diversity without making people feel excluded? And another sort of American example of this is there was a massive campaign that was launched in, I believe it's in California, to really encourage more female engineers. And the flip side of the campaign was that what it did was ended up making a lot of people of color, and especially Black men in America, feel discouraged from applying, which is the exact opposite of what they were doing. So a lot of getting the progression right. It's about getting this and getting it to move forward, and it's getting the right mix of people. And I really think you can't sort of overestimate how important that is to keep a team progressing. You can't progress if the people are all very samey. Now, the last, and maybe we could put the office poll up on here. The last pillar is the budget. So you've done all the other things, and I admit this is what I found kind of most difficult to get my heads around. But while your product is the core, progressing the tech is what makes it happen, as does progressing the team. We're doing it for money, and we're able to keep doing it through money. So it's really important to control the budget. And a big part of tech leadership means knowing what all the costs are, being very, very aware of all the costs, and trying to get all the value that you can out of these costs. Ideally, what you want to do is try and get a 10 times value out of every cost if you can find a way. As a general rule for budgeting, each engineer costs about 1.5 times their salary, and ideally should be bringing back a return on interest of about 3 times their salary. So once you start sort of thinking in these things, when you look at the team, when you look at your diversity policy, when you look at everything that you do, you start thinking about what does this mean? How do I get the return? How do we make this really work for us? And it's quite key in keeping all that moving forward. A while ago, one of my first sort of jobs where I was doing the costing, I remember working out what the cost just for a specific team, working out the cost of a 2-week sprint was, which is 50,000 pounds or euros. I can't remember now, but it was 50,000 something. And it really changed everything, because once you sort of think, rather than here's a bunch of work that needs to be done, you also think of it, the cost of it. It's sort of it creates a sense of urgency that's quite important, but also makes you think more about what you're doing and how you're doing and how important it is to make sure that you get that right, that you use that investment wisely. And the important bit with the budget as well is being cheap isn't the same as having value. Sometimes an engineer will cost twice as much as another engineer, but will bring 5 times the value. Sometimes an engineer will cost twice as much and bring half the value. As a tech leader, you sort of need to know this. You sort of need to work through these things and think about how you can do that. And I've sort of said before, as kind of coming from an engineering background, this is probably one of the hardest bits that I had to adjust to, simply because I wasn't used to thinking like an accountant. But once you get used to thinking, once you get used to tracking everything, which is really the key to any sort of budgeting, it really does start together, and it really sort of does start to make sense. But it's absolutely vital that you keep that budget, as well as the salaries, hosting. If anyone, especially if you use cloud services like AWS, it's really easy to have costs start spiraling out of control without you noticing. So it's really important to keep on top of all those costs. Now, this isn't kind of quite a pillar, but it's very, I think, a very important part of leadership. And it's probably the biggest shift that I found when I went from being an engineer to sort of taking on more and more leadership roles, is that when you're an engineer, you're an independent person, and you're an expert who's relied on sort of for your opinion. And there's a degree where you can pass responsibility either up, down, or sideways, particularly things like the budget and the progressing the team and the marketing and all these things. But once you start getting into a leadership role, and especially as I've noticed that as you sort of get kind of higher and higher up the chain, it becomes more and more important to understand that sort of the whole concept behind serving people and how you really become a servant. I mean, first and foremost, my job as a CTO is to make sure that the CEO, that his vision, in our case it's a he, that his vision gets worked out, gets actualized. It's also really important for him to look good. So another big job is to keep him looking good. But then I sort of half joke and half don't joke with, particularly with the managers, that it's also really important for them to make me look good and to make the department look good. And it's not sort of out of some sort of narcissistic need of validation. It's that the whole kind of serving of the command of serving, it just becomes important that everyone is always looking their best when it comes to how they're looking at towards external, especially to people either external to the department or external to the company. So generally you'll have a CEO who's trying to make the whatever the board is or the investors look good, and then they'll have people who are trying to make them look good. And done properly, I think, as part of that leadership, you need to kind of get into everyone, particularly people in the leadership side, the importance of serving. And you're also serving the people that work for you, the engineers, the managers, and that type of thing. Because if they don't look good, you don't look good either. So there's a degree of reciprocality there. But it's also it's important because when you start kind of looking that way, when you start thinking about how can I make the CEO look good, how can I make the company look, it gives you a degree of or a paradigm of being positive and positivity, which is often kind of the antithesis of an engineering a lot of the time. Because in engineering, the idea is you look for the faults, you find the faults, then you fix it. And that's great, and that's what engineering needs to be. But when you're dealing with leadership, often it's the opposite. And what you have to do is you have to look for what's positive, simply because it's kind of easy in some way, especially within an organization and within a structure. It's easy to see what's bad, but it's very hard to find constructive ways of dealing with things that are wrong. But it's a lot harder sometimes to see the good, but it's also a lot easier to amplify that. So if you're working in a leadership role and you're always looking to see what the positive is, to pick that out and to let that sort of shine brighter, it's going to be a lot more successful than it is always looking for the faults and trying to find kind of, oh, well, this is wrong, we need to fix that. So that sort of whole view of coming comes from that idea where you look where you're serving, you're looking at how can you make your CEO look good, how can you make your team look good, what can you find positive and pick out and sort of amplify that way. So this is the very last slide. If we could put up the useful poll, that would be, well, useful. And all this sort of tails back with the servitude and with all that nicely to the communication, which is that sort of core of leadership that I was talking about. Listening is the key tool to help you sort of bring out that good, to help you see where the good things are. And if you use listening as the base on which you have those 4 pillars where you progress the product, the tech, the team, and you control the budget, this is where it all happens. So if you're an aspiring leader, want or don't want to be a leader at all, just want to understand what your leadership are trying to do, or an established leader wondering sort of how other people do it, I hope these pillars and I hope this talk help you understood. And that's everything. So I think we'll go over now to, does anyone have any questions?